Eckhart Tolle, and Wayne Dyer together.
I first became aware of your teachings when I was living in London, and a friend of mine gave me a book. She worked in a bookstore, the famous Watkins bookstore in London, the oldest metaphysical bookstore in the world, and she gave me a novel, and the author was Wayne Dyer. It was in the 80s, and it was a novel about a woman from outer space who came to the planet to give spiritual teachings.
Right. Her name was Icus. It was actually, my daughter was born that year, and it was her name spelled backwards, Sky, E-Y-K-I-S. And it was about someone who visited another world where it was exact duplicate of Earth, except that the people there were neurotic like we are here, except they were neurotic there because there was a reason to be. When this visitor first checked into the hotel, he turned on the television set and someone gave the news, and then they gave the weather, and they gave the sports, and then they gave the anxiety attack report. The likelihood of anxiety attacking over the weekend, it was coming in high, it was coming in fast over the mountains. You want to get out your Xanax and your no pain and your tranquilizers because it's going to be heavy doses of anxiety, because here on Uranus, which is the title of the place that they went, anxiety really attacks. And Icus comes to Earth, and she's looking at all these people saying, they're having anxiety attacks, but there's no anxiety and it doesn't attack. The original title of that book was going to be called, If You Want to Be Happy, Get Your Head Out of Uranus. But it turned out to be a little bit more serious, and we're actually we're making a movie of that
Oh yeah,
book. It's the only fiction thing I've ever undertaken.
Oh yes. Yeah. Reminds me a little bit of Aldous Huxley wrote a novel called Island, which is about a fictitious island. Somebody gets shipwrecked on this island, where he begins to realize the natives live consciously and in awareness. And even the parrots in the trees have been trained to remind people to be conscious, so they say things like, attention, attention, meaning be present. Be there, one could say, be there as the witnessing presence of your mind. So if you haven't read it yet, you might enjoy that. And is your book still available?
It is.
No?
It's still in print. Everything I've done is still in print. It's amazing. Yes, it's called Gifts from Icus.
Yeah.
But what you're saying reminds me of, do you know who Mary Oliver is? She's a well-known poet. She wrote a poem I used to recite in my talks called Wild Geese. And she was asked, what's the secret to living an enlightened life? And she said, it just boils down to, and it reminds me of what you just said, pay attention, be astonished, and tell other people. She said that's all you need for a successful life. And I think about paying attention.
Is the key.
It is. It's a big part of what you do, I know.
Yes. And that's, of course, I've told that story quite a few times in the past, but not for a few years, so maybe I can say it. It's about a Zen teacher who actually lived, I don't know when, 100 years ago, in Japan, and his only teaching, whenever he was asked to explain the meaning of Zen, his only answer would be to raise his index finger and look at you. That's the meaning of Zen. What it points to, of course, is the state of presence, the alert presence. That is the whole teaching. Of course, Zen is, many people who are drawn to Zen try to understand it conceptually, and they just don't get it.
Right.
I know there are Zen monks who just don't get it because there's nothing to understand conceptually. It's entering the state of consciousness, of presence. So it's frustrating. So Zen developed methods to frustrate the mind even more so that it finally gives up its attempt to understand or to know conceptually.
Right.
And that's really, that is not just Zen, that is really the essence. Even Course in Miracles says, your understanding is not a powerful contribution to the truth.
So true.
And the paradox is that out of that state of presence, very often, if there's really something you need to know, it arises.
Right. Yeah, someone sent me a T-shirt that I gave to my son. It says, don't just do something, stand there. And it was like a Zen master. Yeah.
And that brings us to an interesting topic, and that is being and doing. To be to reconcile within oneself the two dimensions, because here as human beings we are called upon to take action and to also create, as the universe loves to create new forms, billions, trillions of life forms. We are part of this love of the universe to create form. And I know that because I have observed myself, and you know it because you know yourself, the universe also wants to know its own essence through you, the source. It wants the conscious realization of the source. And in human beings, that's expressed as the draw towards to be totally content with what is, to be totally at peace in the present moment, to long for that state of absolute, beautiful, deep peace. And I call that, in a minute I'd like your input, I call that it's the outgoing movement of the universe is wanting to create, and the return movement of the universe is wanting to know itself, and through the human as in its essence. So the universe wants, there's a two, so perhaps everybody here can also feel that within. Yes, you want to do things, but you also want to be. So not to lose being while you do, and not lose yourself in the doing, get stressed, getting the fruit of the action, Bhagavad Gita, not to always look to the next thing to attain, so that remain rooted in being, and then act from there, from that rootedness, not out of egoic need to have, but out of the inner fullness. And I'm sure you have a lot to contribute here too.
I think of Moby Dick, one of my favorite novels, and the author speaks of, in these words, this great writing always intrigues me, and I memorized it when I was in high school. He said, "For as this appalling ocean surrounds the verdant land, so in the soul of man lies one insular Tahiti, full of peace and joy, but encompassed by all of the horrors of the half-lived life." the half-lived life. And when you speak about being and doing, I think one of the major problems, Eckhart, for our world and for us is that we really aren't raised to believe in our extraordinariness, about how extraordinarily, how divine we are, that we're all not just pieces of God, but that we are all God. We are all part of God. And that's something we carry around with us. And this ordinary part of us, the part of us that is, called the ego, the part of us that believes that who we are is what we accumulate and what we accomplish and what other people think of us, and the part of us that is separate from everyone else, and the part of us that feels like we have to own things and so on, and that we're born into this world of where there's nothing to do. There's like when a baby's inside a mother's womb, what does she have to do? What does the baby have to do? In the Tao says, the Tao does nothing, and it leaves nothing undone. It's become my son's favorite mantra, because I say, Sans, come on, do something, let's go. He'll say, I do nothing. And I leave nothing undone. So, but this part of it, so we're sort of snatched out of that perfection and programmed into a life of accumulating and achieving, and we start to believe that this is who we are. And we never get to the part of us that is extraordinary, because the ordinary part of us feels that we're having a successful life if we go through the motions, if we go through school, if we get good grades, if we get into the right school, if we meet the right person, if we fill out the forms, if we pay our taxes, if we don't get arrested, if we follow the rules. This is like this is an ordinary life. And I speak to an extraordinary life, and I have so much respect for the work that you have done over the years. But the extraordinary part of us still has ordinary in it. I mean, we still have to follow the rules, most of them, and we still have to fill out the forms. And I'm sure you pay your taxes, right? And and so you can be an extraordinary being, but you still have ordinariness in it. But beyond ordinary is this, is what we call the soul, because we just don't have another name for it, And in the Tao Te Ching, the opening lines of the Tao say, the Tao that can be named is not the Tao. So you're stuck already. You can't even call it anything, because it goes into two-ness. Now it is what it is and the name that you call it. But the extraordinary part of who we all are is the soul. It's that invisibleness that's formless, that has no boundaries, it has no beginnings, it's birthless, it's changeless, it's deathless. And this part of us doesn't care about winning, it doesn't care about owning, it doesn't care about happiness, it doesn't care about being better than anyone else. It just wants to expand. It wants to grow. It's miserable. The soul is miserable when you contain it, when you put a fence around it, when you put a label on it, when you tell it what it can be and what it can't be. All of us have this extraordinariness called the soul, which is infinite. Because if it wasn't infinite, it would be finite. And if it was finite, you'd be able to find the end of it or the beginning of it. So because it's not finite, it's infinite, this means that what does infinity mean? It's just always expanding. It's just, there's no end to it. There's no end to it. This is the part that we need to address, I think, within ourselves, is this infinite part of us that doesn't need to fit in, doesn't need to be right, doesn't need to be better than anybody else. It just wants to expand and grow and not be told, this is what you can do, this is what your limits are, this is what's not possible for you. And I've always, I don't know about you, but always, my entire life have just been intrigued by extraordinary people, by extraordinary events, by people who can do things. As soon as I see someone can levitate, I was like, I want to know all about that. How do you go about this? Someone who can, Carolyn Mace talks about defying gravity, or Joel Goldsmith says that in the presence of the God realized, the laws of the physical world do not apply. Can you make electronic equipment stop with your consciousness and so on? Those kinds of things, those extraordinary accomplishments. I just read a book that just blew me away. I don't know if you've read this, called Unbroken by Laura Hillerbrand. Have any of you read that? Unbroken? It's one of the great reads you'll ever read in your life, and it's the story of a man who survived impossible things, and he's now 94 years old, and he was shot down during World War II, and he cruised on a raft across the Pacific Ocean. Every word of it is true, but the extraordinariness of this being and what he accomplished and how he survived, those things. I just think that we need to address ourselves, people like us who have a big audience, to creating a world of extraordinary people who look beyond what they were programmed to become, ordinary, filling out the forms and so on, to those where we can expand and really change the world. This kind of thing can really, truly impact the entire consciousness of this planet. I really think it can happen.
Yes. And the basis for that, so in a way, we are talking about creating, and earlier you mentioned that part within everyone, the essence that is timeless and infinite, and that's the being. And so conscious union with that can then lead to awakened, as I call it, awakened doing. So if we go back for a moment to the being part, as Wayne was speaking and as I am speaking, pointing towards that dimension within you, the question is whether at this very moment, so that it's not another belief in your mind. I mean, it's comforting to believe I am an infinite being, but that's a belief. And then can you sense the reality of that? And as we sit here, can we sense the reality of that within ourselves, where you are no longer deriving your sense of identity or your sense of who you are from ideas in your head? That's the start. Because in the normal consciousness, which is unconsciousness, who you feel you are, which of course is the limited self, the conditioned self, the time-bound self, what the Buddha called the self, the delusion, what Jesus pointed to when he said, deny thyself, as one of the essential points of his teaching. Deny thyself, been misinterpreted by the churches as if you had to say, oh, miserable me. That's not it at all. Deny thyself is recognize the unreality of that self, of the basing your sense of who you are on what ideas you hold in your head, thoughts, in other words, that tell you about your story, about who you are, and never feeling really fulfilled. It's always not quite sufficient, so you need to defend this mental edifice of who you are, and so on. You need to add to it. Maybe then I'll be fully myself when I achieve that. So at this moment, can you sense that within you there is an unconditioned, timeless consciousness which has nothing to do with thinking, which is prior to all thinking, which is, you cannot make it into an object and say, there it is, because it's the eternal subject, it's the I, the one I, it's spacious presence. I'm just using different pointers because different pointers work for different people. It's spacious presence. It's a sense of deep aliveness that has nothing to do with your history whatsoever, and nothing to do with your future whatsoever. So if you can touch that within you, that is the liberation from the false sense of self. And once you can sense that, it's actually it's exhilarating to feel that which transcends the limited self in you, that presence that cannot be conceptualized, that cannot be named, the Tao. This is why we're here, to experience that.
The great saint in India named Muktananda was asked the question, what is real? And he said, that is real, which never changes, period. So now you try to define yourself using that definition. Like the question Eckhart is addressing here is, who am I? And the first thing that comes to mind is, well, I'm this body, But how many bodies have you been in since you incarnated just this time? How many bodies have you shown up in? You were in one this big, you were in a little toddler body, you were in one that stands like this, like all my teenage daughters do and roll their eyes. I was in a 20-year-old body, and I just saw a picture of it. I just did a new public television special, and I saw that picture floating across. And when I was in that body, I really believed it was real. But it's been 50 years, and I can't find it. I don't know where it is. Like there's nothing in this body. There's not one cell left over in this body that was in that body. And that's true for every single person watching and every single person in this room. So that who you are is that which keeps occupying new bodies on a regular basis. In fact, if Deepak were up here with us, he would say that the body you came in to watch this presentation with will be very different than the one that you will leave here with. And we can't see the changes going on in that place, but we're in a world. So if everything that is changing isn't real, who we really are, there's a higher self within each and every one of us, or a highest self. And a higher self, to me, one of my teachings was that the Creator puts a spark of Himself into each and every creation. So there's a spark of God in each and every one of us. But my experience, especially lately in my own life, has been that that spark can grow from a spark to a fragment to a segment to something bigger. It can get as big as a soccer ball. It can get bigger and bigger inside of you until you ultimately reach another conclusion, that the same conclusion that Jesus came to when He was about to be stoned because He blasphemed. He said, "Why would you stone me?" And they said to Him that we stone you because you are a man and you claim to be God. And He said, "Is it not written in your laws that I have said, you are gods? You are gods." This comes right out of the mouth of Jesus. And St. Paul, writing in Philippians, in his letters to the Philippians, says, "Have in you the same mind as Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God." But we've taken this idea of this place that you're speaking of, this perfect infinite presence, this place of divine peace, and interpreted the words "I am God" or "you are God" to be the God that we've created in our own images. This God who's angry, and this God who has the power to heal, but restricts it to some and gives it to others. This God that demands payment and fancy, buildings and gold embroidered costumes and so on, and created a God like that. When in fact, again, out of the scriptures, Jesus said, when asked who is God, He said, God is love. I mean, I don't know, is there a better word for it than that?
Yes. And of course, the impermanence and the changing body, or inhabiting different bodies, the same applies to the psychological, because the body is the physical form, and then that's the starting point for most people's sense of identity. That's I am this external appearance and so on. The next place that people use to define their identity through, of course, is the psychological self-image, which is also changing, which consists of the stream of thinking accompanied by certain emotions that continuously happen, that also changes from year to year, who you consider yourself to be, the psychological self. So we have the double delusory identifications. One is with the physical vehicle, and then there is the identification with the mental emotional vehicle also, which is not who you are, which also is part of the continuous flux of forms. And to recognize that is already, when you recognize that, it's a kind of relief in a way. If you really consider the fact of the impermanence of the physical form and the impermanence of the psychological form, you say, wow, it's to the ego, which really ego is the identification with that gives you a sense of self, that's the ego. So to the ego, that's bad news. It says, oh, that's terrible. Everything is impermanent. I don't want to hear that. Says the ego, that's dreadful. It's depressing. Don't talk to me about death, depressing. But there's something else in you that actually feels alive suddenly and exhilarated when you hear the fact of impermanence. And suddenly something awakens in you that is not part of the impermanence, that which does not change. And that we could call it this or that, but it's never quite right. I sometimes call it pure consciousness, the unconditioned consciousness, the formless consciousness. Thought is consciousness having been born into a form. The physical body is consciousness having been born into a temporary physical vehicle. So consciousness assumes form continuously, and that's the deeper meaning of reincarnation. One could say, every time I get caught up in a thought that arises in my head, and by caught up I mean identified with the thought has me in its power, every time that happens, I reincarnate into form, into the thought form. So you reincarnate into physical bodies, but you also reincarnate into the mind continuously, because you identify with the mind. So to stop the cycle of reincarnation, which is what the Buddhists are trying to do, but they have a kind of traditional idea of it, but the more immediate thing you can do is to don't believe in every thought that arises in your head. So you don't get caught up in every thought that arises, and you realize there is a dimension in you that is an aware presence from where you can look at a thought and see it come and go, and you can see it's negative, it has a certain vibrational quality to it, which may be high or low. And so you touch the place where you are not the physical body, where you are not the thoughts and emotions, although these are there, where you are that spacious presence, the awareness for that. That's the eternal I. And that's the light of the world. That's Jesus again, you quoted Jesus. Jesus said two things. He said, I am the light of the world. And then somewhere else he said, you are the light of the world. Both.
Right. That word I am is very big in my consciousness and in my awareness. I've just written a whole book that will be out in the spring on this whole idea of I am. It's the only place in all the scriptures in the Torah, which is the first